Hey everyone, I'm going to take a moment to discuss the concept of death and rebirth. Most of you are familiar with this concept as a central theme in Christianity. The individual comes to Christ, dies, and is reborn, transformed. The old person perishes and a new one emerges. This motif, however, is much more ancient than Christianity. It stems back probably about 40,000 years ago to the Upper Paleolithic, where culture, art itself, began to emerge within caves. Individuals would go deep off into caves, have a shamanic experience, with the cave symbolizing that of the Great Mother, the womb of the Great Mother. After the shamanic experience, coming out transformed, acquired new information that they integrate within themselves that transforms them. And this idea increased in complexity, became more sophisticated as time went on. You see that with the very first artificial wombs, with so to speak, of temples in Göbekli Tepe about 10,000 years ago, entering into the Neolithic times, where huge pillars were erected and most likely had a roof, and there were circular formations. So again, symbolizing the entrance of a cave, the womb of the Great Mother, that the individual treks into and comes out transformed. And then, of course, this continued to evolve into temples like the ziggurats in ancient Mesopotamia, and then eventually into Jerusalem with the temple there, and then later on into churches, symbolizing again the womb, a place where one dies and is reborn. They go in, confess their sins, let the old person die, acquire novel information, integrate that information, and then come out transformed. And in relation to my previous video I'd done on the transformation of the ego, Jung in particular, as well as Neumann, pointed this out, that the process symbolizes more of, besides its spiritual and religious applications, it's ultimately a psychological event and practice, psychological ritual, where an individual, and we become so sophisticated now that oftentimes we practice or can practice transformation within our own homes or anywhere for that matter, which is interesting because even Christ himself went on to state this, that worship God, essentially being transformed even outside the confines of the walls of temples or churches. And how this is ultimately done is through the encounter of novel information. It's the encounter with the unknown, the unconscious forces, and that's essentially what the womb symbolized. And that the temples and the caves of prehistoric times is that of the unconscious elements that lie dormant within the individual. And the only way to really, and also the shadow elements, the parts of us that we would rather not confess. But once you acknowledge, you go into the womb. Of course, this can be done ourselves by taking time and contemplation to really acknowledge what those shadow parts of ourselves are, and to really trek inside the unconscious self, and then seeking out novel information that we can utilize to give us the knowledge that provides us with the power to understand how to integrate those shadow features, extracting what does not need to be integrated with that which has actual utility of the shadow part. And what happens is whenever you extract the useful elements from the non-useful elements of the shadow, is those parts that have no utility ultimately die off, while the useful elements are utilized to integrate within the psyche to make us more whole and transform us and transform our perception. And this is best represented in the ancient Babylonian story of the fight between Marduk and Tiamat. Tiamat representing the unconscious chaos, so to speak. Marduk descends into the abyss, into the unconscious, and kills Tiamat, and out of her creates order. And so he utilizes the parts that are good to go on to create psychic order, so to speak. Unifying the psyche and making it whole. That's how Jung and Neumann interpreted that within psychological application, psychological perspective. That really that's what humans, as we were evolving consciousness, were articulating through narrative. And that narrative became more complex, more evolved, ultimately into Christianity, symbolized through the person of Christ, the ego, the self dying and being reborn, integrating the unconscious features, overcoming quote-unquote death, and descending into the abyss during the 3-day trek before re-emerging, being reborn, resurrected as a new creation. And that's the pathway that we follow as well. And so, but the only way that we can really understand how to separate the useful parts of the shadow from the non-useful parts is through the acquisition of novel information and spending adequate time in contemplation. And then you can ultimately go on, be transformed, and be made whole. And of course, this process is ongoing, as I said before. It's an ongoing, perpetual process of death and rebirth, because you're constantly trying to delve into the unconscious parts of yourself to integrate what is useful and to prune away what is not. And then you go out and you be a more useful, productive, and stronger individual at the end of the day. I hope this helps. Hope you have a wonderful day. God bless.